Have you ever gotten the urge to get in your car and go for a cruise at night? Well, I used to love driving at night, especially when I don't have to go anywhere specific. It's therapeutic for me, at least it used to be. A week or two before I graduated, I went to one of my friend's graduation parties. I left at around 10. I live 30 miles outside of town, and roughly 20 miles of that is dirt roads. I had just turned onto one of those roads. The window was down and the radio was playing softly. It was relaxing. I wasn't going that fast, maybe about 45 miles per hour, just cruising. But up ahead, I saw something moving. Suddenly, it crossed the road in front of me, and I swerved to miss it. I used to drive a 2002 Jeep Wrangler. My dad got it for me as an early graduation gift. We fixed it up and got it into drivable condition together. Wranglers are naturally very top-heavy, and this one was even more so, as it had a 4-inch lift kit. I swerved too hard and rolled into a ditch. I smashed my forehead into the windshield and blacked out. I woke up with a start. I was upside down. I was bleeding pretty badly from a gash in my forehead. I couldn't remember what happened. It took me a moment to realize that I had been woken up by something. Something was lurking around the Jeep, sniffing and shuffling around like a dog. Then a putrid, decaying smell invaded my nostrils. It was strong enough to make me gag. In a flash, I remembered the pale, naked, thin figure walking in the road in front of me. Its horribly long, dangly arms, its tall, thin head, and those small, beady eyes that glowed in my headlights. It wasn't human. I kept a K-bar knife that I bought with birthday money in the Jeep for emergency reasons. The middle console had spilled out in the wreck, so I searched around and found the knife on the roof. Remember, the Jeep was upside down. I grabbed it and cut my seatbelt. I fell onto the roof of the Jeep with a thud. There was an excruciating pain in my left arm. I couldn't move it. I pushed through the pain and sat up. I could hear the shuffling outside grow quicker and more frantic. It must have heard me. Suddenly I could see 2 feet outside the driver's side window. They were, like the rest of the creature, disproportionately long and thin, ending in 4 toes. There was dried blood crusted on them. It scratched on the door, and I knew that it was trying to get in. Frantically, I plunged my hand out the open window and stabbed the creature in the foot. It then let out an ear-piercing shriek and ran off into the night. I then crawled out of the window, and I tried to stand up too quickly and passed out. I woke up in the hospital the next day. My dad had gotten worried about me 20 minutes after I should have been home and went out to look for me. He found me passed out next to my overturned Jeep. I had lost a lot of blood and was suffering from head trauma. Out of fear of being called crazy or not being taken seriously, I told everyone I fell asleep at the wheel. It still didn't explain the scratches on the driver's side door of the Jeep. Scratches that looked like they had been made by a man. For the next few months, there would be strange talk around town. Ranchers in the area would report dead cattle, with their entrails strewn about everywhere. People in cafes would tell stories about seeing strange lights, hearing strange noises, and spotting strange eyes in the night. In time, it seemed everyone had seen the elusive Thin Man of Tandem, New Mexico. But all the talk and reports of such a creature stopped after a few months. The creature and the strange lights disappeared. About once a month, I visit my parents for the weekend, who live about 4 hours away from me. It's a quiet, peaceful drive through remote back roads. Last night, the drive back was like many others, except this time I left later than usual. It was dark for the majority of the drive, and I didn't return home until almost midnight. That being said, it was a nice drive, although I could see the lightning flashing in the distance from a far-off storm that seemed to be following me. About 2 hours in, on the most remote section, I thought I saw something in the distance. I've always been afraid of hitting a deer or a moose, so I tend to slow down at the slightest sign of life. As I approached, I was shocked to see what appeared to be a person lying on the side of the road. I immediately stopped my car and ran out to see if they were okay. As I drew close, I could clearly see it was a girl who appeared to be in her 20s, with dark black hair and torn clothing. "Are you okay?" I asked. There was no answer or any movements. I quickly crouched down and put my fingers to her neck, trying to check for any signs of vitals. There was nothing. I grabbed her wrists, trying to feel for a pulse, and I was shocked at how cold her skin felt. With a sinking feeling, I knew it was too late. Her face was turned away at an odd angle, so I gently reached out and turned it towards me, and I knew for sure that she was gone as soon as I saw her eyes. They stared back at me unblinking. I reached for my phone, ready to dial 911. I briefly hesitated. Do I still call 911 if the person is already dead? Or do I call the local police number instead? Technically, it's not an emergency anymore. Shaking my head, I dialed 911. "Police, fire, or ambulance?" a reassuring voice said on the other end. Police or ambulance. I'm not sure." "Sir, what's the nature of your emergency?" the operator inquired. "Well, I was out driving and there was this girl on the side of the road, but I think she's already dead. She has no pulse, her skin is cold, and she's unresponsive." I spoke quickly, almost stumbling over my words, as I was understandably a little unnerved. I quickly gave the operator my location. "Okay, the police and ambulance are on their way. Are there any signs of injury on her?" the operator asked. "No, she's only muddy, and her clothes are torn," I replied. I was taken aback, as I hadn't realized until just that moment how strange it was that this girl would be dead out here in the middle of nowhere with no signs of injury. I looked around the darkness and I began to feel nervous. I decided to wait in my car. The police showed up fairly quickly, and the officers asked me a few short questions before I was allowed to leave. As I continued driving, I tried to shake off the events of that night. But as I was driving, with no means to distract myself, I understandably found it hard to forget. I finally arrived home, ready to go straight to bed. A little embarrassed, I left the hallway light on outside my door. It may seem silly, but that was my first experience ever seeing a dead body, and I was feeling a bit creeped out. Normally my roommates would help me feel secure, but they both were gone at that time, and the apartment felt strange and empty without them. I fell asleep fairly quickly, but suddenly I woke up around 2:30 a.m. It took me a second to realize why everything felt off. The hallway light, which I had purposely left on, was now off. As I realized this, I felt a chill take over my body as I lay in the darkness, waiting for my eyes to adjust. Slowly, I began to see shapes. I reassured myself that it was all okay. I saw my desk take shape, and my dresser. My yoga mat, which was rolled into a ball on the floor, gave me a fright, until I realized what it was. However, I slowly came to realize that there was one shape that I couldn't place. In the middle of the room was a dark, contorted shape, taking up the center of the floor. I racked my brain as my body froze with fear, and my heart pounded, trying to think what it was I could have left there. It was only when I saw two glimmers that I realized. It was exactly the shape of the girl I found, curled up in the same position she was left in on the side of the road, and the glimmers were exactly where her eyes would have been. A friend of mine told me this story about a girl she met from Sweden who was staying with her for a while. The girl was in her mid-20s, and while my friend told me her name, I can't remember it. I only remember the content of this horrific story, and it will never leave my mind. So this girl, let's call her Jan, was driving to her mom's house. They lived away from the city, in a heavily forested area. There was no streetlights and not many houses. If there were any houses, they were built back into the forest and had long winding driveways before any sign of life. Jan was in her late teens at the time. As she was driving, something up ahead on the road caught her eye. It was a small bundle next to the road. It looked like a baby wrapped up in a blanket. Jane slammed on her brakes, stopping about 50 meters up the road. She backed up her car, and then jumped out as quick as she could, thinking that someone had abandoned a baby on the road. Jan ran over to the bundle and exhaled a sigh of relief. It was only a toy. Just as she picked up the baby, she saw headlights coming down the road in front of her. Suddenly realizing that she was standing on the road alone at night, she ran quickly back to her car and jumped in. The car behind her sped up, closing in quickly, coming up very close to the back of her car, and began honking its horn. Jan started to panic, and she began to drive faster and faster, constantly checking her rearview mirror. Eventually, she reached her mother's driveway. Her mom lived deep in the woods, and she thought to herself if the car followed her down the long driveway, she would call her mom and tell her to phone the police. As she turned into the driveway, the car turned as well, still following very close behind her. She kept thinking back to the baby toy found on the side of the road, and how creepy this evening was turning out to be. Jane then pulled out her phone and called her mom, and told her that she was being followed, and to call the police right away. She was expected to arrive in about 5 minutes. Both cars were going way too fast on that narrow dirt road with no streetlights. She then saw her mom's house in the distance, but the pursuers were still very close behind her, still blaring their horns so loudly Jane's ears began to ring. As she got to the house, she jumped out of the car. Her mom was standing on the front porch waiting for her with a kitchen knife. Jane ran up to her as quickly as she could. The car that was following also stopped, and the doors flew open. An elderly couple jumped out and started to yell and point at Jane's car. "Hey, someone's in the back seat of your car!" they screamed. Jane then realized what happened. A man jumped out of the back seat of her car and took off into the forest. Everyone looked at each other in shock. The car that was coming down the road had seen someone jump into her car when she stopped to check out the bundle. They had most likely left it there on the road, waiting for people to stop. As I said at the beginning, a friend of mine told me this story, and I believe it to be true. If you're ever on the road and you stop to check something, always lock your doors when you get out of your car. I have trouble sleeping at night. I'm not going to whine and complain about having insomnia. I just can't sleep at night. Some say I have an anxiety problem. Others say I just need to take pills. But I've never gone to a doctor about it. Instead, I just get in my truck and drive around for about an hour at night to relax and unwind. Usually it works. And while expensive, I do sleep well through the night with no problems. I live in Lubbock, Texas. For those of you who know the area, you know that once you leave, it's several miles in either direction before you reach another town. And even when you do get to the next town, it's so small that you could throw a stone across it, and it would be out before it hits the ground. Driving on Highway 84, it's a long way before you hit the town of Littlefield. It's a nice drive to make when you're alone. Very calm, quiet, and dark. The kind of drive that almost puts you to sleep behind the wheel. It was a typical cold late January night. I recently started up classes at Texas Tech, and I was feeling a bit stressed. So I did what I always do around midnight when I can't sleep. I grabbed my keys, threw on my coat, got a small cup of warm coffee, and hopped in my truck. I took Highway 84 that night as I hadn't driven on the road since I came back from winter break. As I made my way down the long stretch of open road between Shallowater and Anton, I heard a tap on my passenger side window. I figured that it was a rock or something and ignored it, but then I heard it again. It was 3 distinct taps on my passenger window, like someone was trying to get my attention. I turned my head to look out the window, and to this day, I wish I hadn't. Staring back at me with black eyes was a man. His face was pale, almost gray, sitting in the dead center of the window, smiling. That smile was the most evil thing I've ever seen. He bore all of his teeth with his wide smile. They were pearly white, and not one of them was out of place. His hair was jet black and short, almost like something out of the 1950s. But that smile, that never-ending grin he wore, has been etched into my mind forever. I jumped and jerked my truck slightly into the other lane, before recovering and straightening out again. I had taken my eye off the window, hoping that what I saw was just a hallucination. I looked back, and he was still there, just smiling at me like he had been waiting to see me. He raised his hand and started waving at me. I turned my head forward and stared straight ahead. I jerked my truck into the left lane and then swung it back to the right, but I didn't look to see if he was gone. I was too afraid to look. I kept telling myself to keep my eyes on the road and find a place to turn around. Then I see something out of the corner of my eye. I glance over and it's the man. He was running on all fours, naked. My jaw dropped. I was going 75 miles per hour. I floored it and raced away from the guy. I then heard him jump into the back of my truck. I checked my rearview mirror, and there he was, staring back at me, still smiling. I'm almost in tears at this point. I finally turn around and slam on the brakes and check my rear view. He never moved. It was like he had no momentum at all. I didn't look to make the turn. I just did it, and I hit the gas as soon as I was on the road again. I didn't bother to look at the speed limit. As far as I'm concerned, this was an emergency. I returned to Lubbock without the thing in the back of my truck. I know this because as I turned onto my street, he was standing on my front porch, waving at me.
There's always a reason.